good morning, afternoon and evening to all of you from Parliamentary Pondering, and we are today at a church in London and we're very happy to be here because, as you know, John is Jewish, I'm Muslim, and we're trying to do a bit of interfaith harmony by being present here and talking about what exactly? Talking about demography, talking about religion, talking about race, talking about immigration, talking about IDPs.
Yes.
And I will now start and I will give you a certain amount of facts, John, and then you will be on the hot seat.
Okay.
The facts are as follows. The facts are that there are 61 countries out there whose population is decreasing, whose population is decreasing, and by 2022 it will be a 1% decrease from last year. There are about 8 billion estimated in the entire world in terms of population. India will take over China in terms of population growth rate. By 2080, there will be 10.4 billion of us on this earth. And in terms of Europe, EU, in 2020, the numbers were going down, 744,000 decrease, and in 2021, there'll be a 1.4 million decrease.
Okay.
Those are the facts. Other than that, we are supposed to have a 2.1 birth rate per woman to have some stability in terms of population growth, etc. Now, the aging population shares, that the countries who are taking the aging population shares are as follows: China, Japan, UK, US, and India. I'm giving you these facts so that we can then have a bit of, thought and give our thoughts to our viewers and be thought leaders as such, as we have been doing earlier. Africa versus Asia is the new continent, which is now going to be the most populous and the one which is going to grow the fastest. Okay. Nigeria is the country which obviously has been flagged within Africa as the most, which is going to be hitting about the same as the US pretty soon. Okay. And therefore, we need to look at, and I'm giving you a hint about immigration patterns, or whether they should be encouraged to stay within their countries, and there should be more GDP growth rate and more opportunities for employment within Africa, clearly. Sure. If not, then of course they're going to spill over in the rest of the world. 2030, over 65, the population which is over 65 years of age, there'll be 1 billion of us. And therefore, one needs to look at the, also, interestingly, the inactivity in the young men generation versus the young women generation post-pandemic. So yes, that is also something. I will go on to, I will now shift to you and I will say, I've given you a certain amount of facts. What do you have to say?
First of all, I think it's very important to distinguish between immigration and asylum, and also to distinguish between immigration for permanent residence and migratory movements, which are temporary phenomena whereby people go somewhere else, possibly for a significant period on a work permit, but they don't migrate. And there is an important difference between those things. My overall feeling is that we are in an interdependent world in which, just as you have flows of capital, so you will tend to have flows of labour as well. It is obviously, I think, better, so far as developing countries are concerned, to try to encourage, hone and nurture the creation of stable domestic economic bases so that there are employment opportunities in people's home countries. I don't think huge numbers of people are moving country and intending to change citizenship for economic advantage, but I think that you inevitably do get significant flows of people who are very uncomfortable where they are because of domestic tension, because of civil war, because of human rights violations, and they seek to go elsewhere. Now, no one country can accommodate unrestricted numbers of migrants, and obviously if you have unrestricted numbers, that tends to conduce, Marvi, to tension and hostility and can increase the numbers of racist incidents and so on. And so what does that lead me to conclude? Well, it's enormously difficult to achieve, but it seems to me that as far as both immigration flows are concerned and flows of asylum seekers, the more you can develop common policies across the world, and possibly, in some cases, supranational policies, like an EU migration policy or an EU asylum policy, that is preferable, because that way you can coordinate and organise a distribution of numbers. If it's a case of each country on its own, just doing its own thing, well, I think it's very difficult to get any sort of coordinated policy at all, and it's very messy. How do I feel about immigration? My overall feeling about immigration in my own country is that immigration has been far more a positive than a negative. I don't accept what I would call the racist critique that the country has been gravely damaged by immigration. I don't think that's true. You sometimes get people sort of saying, oh, these immigrants are taking our jobs, or these immigrants are taking money out of the public purse in benefits and so on. Well,
extreme right-wing
it's an
views
extreme
all over
right-wing
the world.
sort of fascistic view, but actually the overwhelming evidence is that migrants tend to contribute more to the national coffers and the GDP
and
than they
innovation.
take from them. And innovation. And I would say my country, I didn't think this when I was a young man. I had very extreme, rather stupid views, but that was 40 years
After
ago.
wisdom in the House of Commons of 22 years.
After 22 years experience in the House of Commons, I suppose I've mellowed. And I feel that my country, the UK, is richer in every way for the fact of the migrations that have taken place to it. And over the last 50, 60 years, there has been a very substantial wave of immigration from the new Commonwealth of Pakistan and elsewhere. And my feeling is that the country is better off as a result. It's better off economically, it's better off culturally, it's better off in terms of the range of cuisine. It is, frankly, a more interesting place.
Some of them might just enter Downing Street.
And one child of migrants might even end up as Prime Minister. I think I'm right in saying.
One of them is being blocked right
leadership
now,
contenders have
from what I've read.
Born and brought up in the UK, but a number of them, may well have parents who were born elsewhere. And
but these trends are interesting.
Are they likely to end up in number 10 Downing Street? It's perfectly possible that one will do so. And how do I feel about that? Well, I must say I think that it would be an extremely positive thing. We should have an election on merit, so to speak, so whoever wins the Conservative leadership election, or in the future a Labour leadership election, when there is next one many years to come, the result should be determined by who's the best candidate. But it will be a very positive and healthy thing for the country if somebody is elected who is from a migrant background, and people are cool with that.
Coming back to these trends, I think what hits me is, number one, I want to say very clearly that my thought leadership in terms of vision documents started with the President Musharraf and then went on with the PMLN. We were dealing with Vision 2030 documents, and we were trying to make policy regarding that. And I think immediately the first thing that comes is demographic dividend versus demographic disaster. Demographic dividend versus disaster. That's one thing that was drilled down my head.
That's a really good slogan. Dividend versus disaster.
And that's President Musharraf. But even with PMLN, the issue was, how do we make sure that there's no brain drain? That was really important, that we maintain the best and we don't get rid of anyone, and we make a suitable environment within the country. That should be any developing country or any country's objective, that you make sure that your people are so happy within that they don't need to migrate outside, right? That should be logical enough. But can you provide everyone employment opportunities to the same extent? Everyone's free to move in, and it's a free world, I mean, you can't clamp onto them and say, you can't go and you can't. Everyone lives once, they have a right to work wherever they wish to work, right? That's my fundamental belief. But as policymakers within our country, we have a responsibility to give them the best environment possible. So within that, I was just thinking...
And some countries in immigration policies, let's face it, are more restrictive than others.
And within that, I was just looking at these trends. Now, if the aging populations are now China, Japan, UK, US, India, what does that mean? That means that these countries will have a more difficult time in terms of their GDP growth rate if they don't sort out their aging populations. Pakistan, for one, I mean, we don't need to be stuck on Pakistan, but it has a great demographic dividend opportunity here, and hopefully the country's leaders, will make something of it. But this African continent example versus Asia, this is the new trend, because Asia was the one that was flagged as the new continent which was going to make it. But if Africa is now being flagged, there's a reason for it. And I remember this at Sciences Po, we went through a lot of these studies about how structural improvements are required within the system to be able to make sure that there's a leap as such, and that they don't get stuck with the reforms that should have taken place, many aspects.
Yeah.
So they kind of advance to the current reforms and they take a leap forward, minusing that learning curve, and they learn faster.
Yeah.
I feel that since so much thought has gone into that from the African Development Bank perspective, from EU perspective, that and from the UN perspective, everyone's trying to make an effort that Africa not just survives the leap, but actually is ready and is actually, let's just say, running faster than it could. An example I wish to give is the technology side. In terms of mobile phones, the kind of coverage, the kind of has fundamentally improved and increased in the last couple of years. There's many examples. I don't want to go into the African example so much, but what I'm trying to explain is that the continents have shifted. Number one, there are certain countries who are aging faster, and there are others who are not aging faster. So obviously, you might just need that. Those people from those countries who are not aging within an aging population country to make sure that your economy does not stagnate as such.
Well,
otherwise, you have a stagnation issue. Japan has a
Sure.
stagnation issue. UK is clearly flagged as a stagnation issue. And EU generally, the population is dropping.
Sure.
Significantly.
Well,
now, if you look at the difference between 744,000 versus 1.4 million within 1 year, what does that say to you? That says, as a thought leader, that says EU is flagged as a stagnating economy, and they need to make certain changes within their immigration laws immediately and fast, and not have these disasters on national television of Rwanda, of all these red flags.
Sure.
Because that doesn't
you need
serve.
to invest in the productiveness.
It's not like I'm trying to send more people to EU. I'm just trying to say, if you don't have, just as a small basic example, if you don't have the right kind of population in there, the economy of the EU, not GB, I mean not UK obviously, but of the EU will suffer. And if you look at UK, it's the same thing, because the numbers are approximately the same.
Yes, I mean the ageing population, is a fact of life, and it's a commentary on, what is a very widespread phenomenon of increased.
Yeah. The UN has flagged it really interestingly.
Partly because of disease survival, of course, and the advance of medical technology enabling us to keep people treated.
That's how the UN has dealt with
supported for longer.
That's how the UN has dealt with it.
But you have to have the young population producing on a big scale, and that means investment in human capital and skills. And it speaks to the importance of having an extremely well-educated and trained workforce.
Skilled workforce.
Skilled in particular, so it doesn't have to be. It may be university educated, it may not be. It will depend, but you've certainly got to have a large supply of domestic labour that is highly qualified, and can deliver for the country as a whole. And, that's a big challenge here in the UK, where we've still got significant numbers of people who have not been developed to their full potential and can't contribute that productively to the economy. And, the pressure, I think, for people to acquire more skills and be better educated is remorseless. In fact, because of the expansion of higher education, which in many ways is a wonderful thing, there has been a side effect, and that is that more and more and more people are needing to go beyond getting an initial degree and having to get a master's degree or some other postgraduate qualification if they're to advance in the workplace, because of the sheer numbers of people. I think we touched on this the other day in one of our recordings, because of the sheer numbers of people who've got a first degree. And it doesn't really distinguish them. And so some jobs that used to be done by non-graduates are now being done by graduates. And if people who are graduates want bigger and better rewarded jobs, they will very often have to train longer and possibly in additional disciplines.
Things are getting tougher and more competitive.
So basically the world marketplace is getting tougher. It is getting more competitive.
And also health-wise, which is what the UN Secretary General flagged of this particular report. He did not flag particularly the fact that there were aging populations, but he flagged specifically the fact that there was a healthier aging population. You see? So the fact that we are making advancements on the health side is what was flagged. I think what needs to be probed and what needs to really come out of the leaders within these countries is a strategy, is a grand strategy as to how they will deal with immigration flows, which will go to their benefit, frankly. I mean, I'm pretty clear on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I see no other way to it. So therefore, it needs to be a bit more, now coming back to a very critical question. This leads us towards how people interact with migrants. I have been personally involved, John. I was a civil military coordinator in my country for IDPs, which means that when we went through the war on terror, our government was very, very efficient, as efficient as we could have been, to deal with the problem, and we moved our people to IDP camps, internally displaced people, to camps, so that we could flush out the terrorists, and we were successful in that particular mission as such. In the process, I dealt with a lot of IDPs, and I stayed with them in their camps. I ate with them, I cooked with them, I was a part of their lives, and especially in Ramzan. I remember that was specifically the case. My point being, I know the plight of IDPs. Imagine the plight of not internally displaced people, but people who are migrating countries where the language is not known, the culture is not known, the religion are different, it's a different, it can be very overwhelming, and it has been, and people have died whilst, you see so many stories of people dying on these boats, and countries putting up barriers, and countries saying, and that's against all humanity.
I think it's against all humanity.
You're killing people on your shores. How do you explain that? How do you respond to God? We're sitting in a...
People do not take, Marvi, those sorts of risks coming over in very, very flimsy boats unless they're desperate. And if they're coming across, in such hazardous conditions, it's because they're fleeing persecution or have been trafficked. And
they're just looking for better economic opportunities. They're dying of poverty.
Well, in many cases,
they're dying of poverty.
It may well be that they're fleeing persecution or indeed egregious human rights abuse, or, as you say, it could just be that the conditions of life in the host country are so grindingly awful, and all they have to look forward to is a life of abject poverty. And so they decide, yes, it is worth taking a somewhat hazardous route to go somewhere where there are better opportunities. Now, you do have to have some controls, because countries can't just admit unlimited.
It's like visas, right?
Yeah, but I do think that when people see the humanitarian tragedies, they're moved by them. And I think most fair-minded people would say, it must make sense to operate as a country in a humanitarian fashion, and for all countries that are committed to democratic principles and principle of human safety and freedom from violence and so on, it must make sense to try to admit as many people as one reasonably can,
and yet when
on the basis we want to give sanctuary, but give sanctuary to people fleeing persecution and give the chance of a better life for people who come here. That chance may be an ongoing and permanent chance, or it may be that they're here only temporarily.
And the kind of xenophobia that meets them, that awaits them in these countries, or just generally I want to talk about the kind of political, now coming back to our politics, the political parties, the kind of shift I have personally seen, because I've been analysing this, and I've seen, if you take France, for example, Marie Le Pen, and the right-wing movements, they've tempered a little bit their outward projections or their outward narrative to make sure that they are not so, how can I use the right words, that they are not so offensive, and that they're not seen as xenophobic. And yet the underlying feature of their narrative is slightly dicey, I would say.
I think it's more than slightly dicey. I think it's extremely offensive. And
very
I'm sorry to say this, but
I don't want to pinpoint France because I'm francophone, but I do want to flag a certain amount of...
Well, I'm sorry to say that
and the kind
I don't accept the good motives of those people on the extreme right. In other words, am I inclined to believe them if they say, we're not racist, or, we're actually very mainstream and so on? No, you'll usually find with Le Pen's party, for example, that they've got a track record as long as your arm of making absolutely
and yet they have a large majority in parliament this time. So we are looking at trends like that. We're looking at trends on the Latin American side. We're looking at trends in many countries where there is a shift, of a bit of tempering of narrative, even though, it is maybe, the same, but in a new packaging.
Yes, and I do accept that sadly, some of the racist parties have got significant appeal.
And populist appeals.
Sorry?
Populist.
And populist appeals.
Because it's xenophobia.
They appeal to people on the basis of grievance. It's a classic fascist tactic down the generations, almost down the centuries. There's nothing new about it.
What's new about it, John?
Your disadvantage, your lost opportunity, your repressed existence is the fault of that bloke.
Let's zoom into what's new in 2022 in this particular equation. We've had this problem since generations and since centuries and since millennia. However, what is new facing us and what is new going forward? So what are we saying as thought leaders?
I suppose, I don't know whether it's new, but it's very evident in an extremely pronounced form, is the sheer numbers of people engaged in migratory flows as a result of civil war or equivalent discord, internecine strife in their own countries. And that is producing very, very large numbers of people who feel desperate, who have nothing, and who consider themselves to have no future in their own home, in their own homeland. So they want to go elsewhere. It does seem to me that this is a phenomenon on a bigger scale than, for example, when I was born. It's a very big phenomenon, and it isn't readily soluble overnight, because no government, no collection of governments can make a war-torn world into an absolute oasis of calm and tranquility. And even if they could do that, they're not going to do it anytime soon. It's going to be a very long-term project. So as long as there is strife, as long as there is civil war, as long as there is bloodshed, as long as there is human rights abuse in the course of war, there will be movements, because people, when they're desperate and utterly despairing of their present plight, will try to swap it for something better.
Certainly.
And that's bound to be the case. And I think that will be an ongoing phenomenon. So what's the challenge? I suppose the challenge is to try to do the right thing and the decent thing. Not
decent thing. I like that.
Yes. Well, what does that mean, do the decent thing? I think it means try to absorb where we can into our country people who are willing to come here and want to work hard and observe the rules, and who are prepared to make some commitment. So I think it is a perfectly reasonable thing that one would hope that people who come to one's country and who look to work here will develop a familiarity with the English language, for example.
Certainly.
I think that is to be expected. In fact, historically, it's been a very coruscating criticism of Britons that we tend to assume that everybody speaks our language. And around the world,
you're coming into a country, you do as the Romans do. I mean, you speak the language at least. You don't need to do as the Romans do, but at least speak the language. How are you going to work on this?
And I think it's reasonable to hope that that they will try to equip themselves with the English language. And I think that most people would say that's a fair thing to do.
And also, one example that hits me personally, because I've got Syrian blood. My grandmother was Syrian Saudi. So when I look at the Syrian situation, and when I see individuals being flagged as model cases of immigration in Germany, etc., and they're so happy now that they've settled and they've learned the language, they've got the German nationality and they're settling well, it makes me feel happy for them personally, yes. But it also makes me feel sad that there's a complete break of the system back in Syria for yes. them to have to move and for them to be. Syria was super beautiful. I mean, it's still a gorgeous place. I haven't been back since the war. I haven't been back since the war. My last visit was when there was obviously no war, and my 25-year-old today was about a toddler then. So I have beautiful memories in my ancestral home there in Damascus. But it makes me sad that my fellow Syrians have had to move from their beautiful homeland and are searching for jobs and things outside. Yeah, okay, they're happy now.
And it's a commentary on what?
It's a commentary on the misgovernment and war. Sure. Who's responsible for this disaster? So those leaders are responsible. They need to take ownership, is my point.
Yeah. I entirely agree with that. It's almost an inevitable consequence.
There are millions of such examples. I've just taken the Syrian example.
Of a belligerent regime which tramples on people's human rights, that the country will be insecure, not contented, and less productive than it otherwise would be. Yeah. And it must almost follow as night follows day, that if you've got despotic government, abusive human rights, repressive state apparatus, an underemphasis on education, for example, particularly for girls, that is going to damage the economy. And where you've got, for example, phenomena like the Taliban, I mean, that does the most enormous damage. Of course, it produces migration flows, but it also means that
it's in
50%
my backyard.
of the population doesn't get to advance because 50% of the population is decreed not suitable for education. That is the sheer poisonous bigotry.
A lot of confusion within the Taliban leadership on some of them being very positive on girl education and others not. So we're seeing a split currently within the Taliban leadership, and the split is demonstrated of the fact that there will be confusions in terms of policy execution, and people will suffer as a result of the policy confusions. But coming back to now coming to religion, my faith is what I am. It's my identity. I am Muslim and very proud of it. How do you feel about your faith?
The truth is that I'm not a practicing Jew, and I haven't practiced the Jewish faith for decades. Now, I think many years ago, in fact even decades ago, I said that in an interview in, I think, the Jewish Chronicle. And somebody who was known to my family, when he next saw me, told me off and said,
how could you say that?
He thought that I was basically trying to disown my past, and I said, or my heritage, and I said, no, sorry, you genuinely misunderstood. I wasn't in any sense seeking to deny the fact of my Jewish heritage. The only point I was making is that I don't have a religious commitment. I completely respect yours, but do I have a strong religious commitment? No. I have been into synagogues over the years a number of times, and I went to synagogue, as a child. I went to shul, as we used to call it, and I had a mitzvah at the age of 13, as one does in the Jewish faith. I did have that on Valentine's Day 1976. But if you say to me, John, have you been an observant Jew? No.
What does it mean to be an observant Jew? Very quickly, very quickly.
I think it means somebody who goes to synagogue regularly and or prays in the home on a regular basis. And I don't do that. So in that sense, I'm not observant, and I'm not particularly observant of Jewish dietary laws. So, for example, would I eat pork? I would eat pork. So it may well be that some Jewish people would say, well, you're not very observant, why do you call yourself Jewish? Well, Jewishness is also about ethnicity and where you hail from, your background historically, your forebears and so on. And I've always thought it important to be upfront, open and proud of my heritage. So, as I am of mine. In common with my father, I don't think much of people who are Jewish and live in free societies, i.e. where there's no persecution, but try to hide their Jewishness. I'm not saying it's a very widespread phenomenon. It probably isn't a widespread phenomenon, but I think it does happen, and that I rather despise and disparage. So my attitude is that I'm always very open about my Jewish heritage and origin, but I'm just not a strongly religious person. And why? I suppose, I say this in this wonderful church and with due reverence to your own very strong religious faith, Marvi, I suppose I say that because I find it incredibly difficult to reconcile the sheer scale of human evil in the world.
I'm glad we're talking
about depravity with the existence of some beneficent, transcendent being who is ministering to our needs. So that's a roundabout way of saying I find it hard
I disagree,
to see,
but
how
fundamentally disagree with that. But
great God looking after us all, when there is so much evil in the world. But then people will often say, well, that's the mystery of God's power and God's will. You don't know it, and you can't guess it.
Let me give you some facts on this side, because what you're saying is not new in the sense that I'm not shocked by what you're saying, but of course I disagree because I'm a practicing Muslim. I have my own views on this, but what you're saying is not shocking, because in 2001 the number of religiously belonging who associated with a particular faith, people who associated with a particular faith, were about 77%. This number in 2011 dropped to 68%.
Okay.
I wonder what it's going to be in 2021 survey. Okay, but the unaffiliated were about 1/3.
Yeah.
The good news from my perspective, and because I'm religious, well, I suppose I am religious to a certain extent. Is that 87%. This will increase to 87%. So there is I didn't realize that. I thought, oh, the number of religiously unaffiliated people is going up, which was my understanding. There's a book by Dunbar, How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. And we always discuss some book or the other in our show for some thought process for our viewers. I would zoom in on this, and I would say that there is a trend. There's not a trend, but there are trends which are clearly showing that the religiously affiliated are on the rise. Now, why is that happening? That's what we need to give our viewers. Why, in your opinion, is that happening? I have my specific opinion on this. I shall give it straight after yours.
No, sorry, we need to do that.
The religiously unaffiliated is decreasing, and the religiously affiliated is on the rise. So people are associating more with religion going forward. Now, whether you like it or not, that's a trend that's happening in the world. What do we as two thought leaders have to say about that? I'm not surprised by this trend, because wherever there's crisis, pandemic, conflicts, there will be an urge to look for
sources of comfort.
To look for sources of comfort. What bigger source of comfort than religion? And other than that, when religious identity is co-opted by the state, I quote from this book, the results are disastrous, and we have seen that.
Yes.
So you can say, oh no, but the state has nothing to do with religion. We will not allow the headscarf, the cross, the this, the that. But the results are there. You can't just suddenly say, we won't allow it, so therefore it will not exist. It exists. And it is on the rise. My point is, how will the world deal with it? Because the world is not dealing with it properly, in my humble but calculated opinion. I have reason to believe that the world is not dealing with religion the way it should be dealt with. My religion is not, I find that there needs to be tolerance. That's what I've been taught as a child by my dad, that you are who you are, but does not mean that you're intolerant of the other.
No.
And we have been discussing the other.
I understand the word tolerance.
And you understand the word other.
Yes.
Versus us. So I have been taught that, but not everyone has been taught that.
No.
For example, I give you Muslim. Sure. I was born as Sunni. I was married into Shia, but I thought of myself as a mix of both. And there was nothing wrong with it, in my humble opinion, because I was taking the best of Sunni and the best of Shia, and I was saying, we're Muslims at the end of the day. Why have these divisions? Whereas you can actually, bring the best of both sides and move forward. Yes. So I have been taught tolerance, taking the best from your religion and projecting that. We are Muslims.
I prefer to use a different word. I understand the word tolerance, but I personally prefer to use the word respect. And I don't want to quibble. But the difficulty I have with the word tolerance is that, although it is often used in a positive way as a symbol of how people should behave towards each other, I feel that tolerance is really about putting up with something of which one doesn't very much approve. Whereas I think I would say that relations between faith communities, and indeed relations between members of faith communities and people who are not members of faith communities at all and have no faith, should be characterised by respect. In other words, people should respect each other
I see your point.
and respect the right to be different. Now, that growth in religious affiliation and commitment around the world, is by no means a negative phenomenon, and you can no more stop it than you can stop water flowing into a stream. So there's not much point in being opposed to it, or angered by it, or upset by it, or frightened by it, or resentful of it. I'm certainly not. I suppose I feel that where the damage is done, where the evil intercedes, is where you have not really the practice of religion, but the misguided and abusive interpretation of religion. So, just to give one example, and you could come up with multiple examples from around the world, I've always thought, in looking at Burma, a country of interest to me, Myanmar, it is truly shocking that there are very active subscribers to the Buddhist faith, monks with very, very strong opinions, who advocate violence against Muslims. And I sort of stop and think to myself, how can any religious person seriously think it can be justified to advocate the infliction of violence on members of another religious grouping or faith? It is utterly intolerable. But as we know, there are people who say that they are subscribers to the Islamic faith, representatives.
But they are
of
terrorists
Islamic
and they're
State,
not Islam.
and they're terrorists.
And therefore, I'm glad you made this point.
They're distorting and misrepresenting and
a beautiful
abusing and suborning a beautiful thing and using it for mischievous, and indeed not just mischievous, but destructive purposes.
They cannot be called, we don't call them...
Can they be called Muslims?
No, they can't. If they're going to kill...
representatives of the faith?
If they're going to kill, the way these terrorists have killed, but I wouldn't want to call them Muslim terrorists. They're just terrorists. They have nothing to do with Muslim. They have nothing to do with Islam. Please don't link us with them, So the same way in Burma, I feel very strongly about that. My faith is beautiful. It's positive. It's inclusive. It's not destructive. There's no element of, if you don't agree, you need to kill. No. And minorities in Islam, I want to make this point, have been given the utmost respect, and they have been given a lot of space to live peacefully and happily, and that is the beauty of Islam. So if anyone uses Islam for destructive terrorist purposes, they're not Muslims. Please don't associate us with them. And I'm glad this was brought
and no
up.
person of religious faith
with half a
hate.
brain. Yeah.
No person of religious faith
The word hate is
actually
was banned in my childhood.
Right.
Yeah, so I was not allowed to use the word.
No, and of course it's
isn't that a good upbringing?
That's very good upbringing.
I would
Congratulations to your parents.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good nurture.
Yeah, why hate? Why, there's no such word as hate, young lady. Dislike, you have an opinion which is different.
Sure.
These
Dislike
days,
or disagree,
but not hate. Because that inculcates a certain viciousness, which as a child, if you have been told, no, you can't use that. So therefore my Sufi
which
influence...
often manifests itself in violence.
It does, and that's why the Sufi influence in my politics has been, I feel, nurturing and positive and soft, and it's a softer side. And I have learned how to, I think there's a lot of interfaith harmony that we can promote by the softer sides.
Yes, and there is good interfaith dialogue in parts of the UK, or in fact, across the country, there are some very good models of it.
Even in the UN, there's a special, there's a special department. There's a special
aimed at the promotion of interfaith.
Yes, and there's special. I think there's a special rep who deals with this, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, at the international level, multiculturalism and is promoting interfaith dialogues.
Yes.
But are we doing enough within our states to be saying, yeah, we're doing enough? Because when I look at the kind of, forget religion now, but just on politics, the kind of trolling, the kind of abuse, the kind of, if you don't agree with me, then you're just dumb, stupid, bad, evil, corrupt, you name it, Well, I'm sorry, but just because you have a different political opinion based on different political experiences does not mean you are intolerant. So I'm just saying, within political parties, the kind of education that is being given to their workers, I find that very, very, let's just say, not reformist. It's going back. It's going backwards. And I don't know if you see the same trends in your part of the world, but this is something that I have openly spoken about in my part of the world.
I think, for example, at the moment in the UK, race relations measured over a 5-decade period have greatly improved.
Okay.
There have been blips, and I'm sorry to say that after the Brexit referendum there was a serious blip, and frankly an upsurge, almost an explosion of racist graffiti, abuse, threats, and in some cases acts of violence. And that I found chastening and really upsetting, because I thought that we had kissed goodbye to the era in which you saw offensive racist slogans. They used in the 1950s in Britain to be horrible pieces of graffiti, or sometimes even posters up in homes owned by private landlords, which were incredibly offensive, saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And yet post-2016, you saw the daubing of slogans suggesting that Eastern and Central Europeans who came to live in the UK should go home, when in many cases they had made their home here in the UK, and that I thought was a tragedy.
And contributing positively to
innovative
economy.
To the country, and not least to the strength of the economy. Now, why did that happen? I suspect that the conduct of the referendum campaign by some people, not by all participants, but by some people on the Brexiteer side, spawned frankly, a renaissance of racism, and it appeared almost to give permission to people with bigoted opinions the opportunity freely to express them. And that I did find very depressing, because, you know, I would naturally tend to the view, which I rather imagine, Marvi, we would share between us, that the more educated and civilised a country is, the lesser incidence of racism it will have. So has the problem gone away? No. I'm afraid, you know, it is still there. By comparison with
and looking at the demographics, there's an urgency to get rid of this problem.
Yes, by comparison with 50 years ago, it's not as bad, but it is still, you know, a very pronounced phenomenon. And if people don't think that we are a tolerant, respectful people, you know, that has, I think, potentially fatal consequences for the country in terms of our standing in the world and our reputation. After all government ultimately rests upon opinion. The opinion we have of ourselves, the opinion we have of others, and the opinion that others have of us. And I think it's very important for us to be, as a country, as I'm sure you feel, modern, forward-looking, pluralistic, and welcoming. Again, going back to an respectful, and again going back to an expression I think I used the other day. Yes, respectful, and I think I used the expression the other day, the capacity to disagree agreeably.
On this great note of disagreeing agreeably and being modern, pluralistic, respectful, as a society, I'd like to conclude today's session. And I'd just like to say that we have discussed race, we've discussed demography, we've discussed religion, but we have discussed humanity at the end of the day. And what we're saying as values, or as thought leaders, what we consider important, will help the DEI of corporates, will help nurture better societies within the within the political system. And hopefully there will be more respect for each other, and not a distinction of the other. At the end of the day, we're all from the same roots, from Adam and Eve. And on this great note, if you allow, I will say goodbye to our viewers. See you next time. Bye-bye.